So what I'm doing is I'm doing the underpainting, which puts in some colour behind before we start in with the rocks. Now I've got a mix of blue and yellow here. This is a Windsor yellow, which is sort of a very basic lemony yellow, and ultramarine blue, which is a reddish mid blue. Now these two give a fairly grey sort of green. That's fine for what we're trying to achieve. So with the brush, what we're doing is, as I said, we're underpainting. So we're giving that bit of colour so that once we put the dark colours in, some of this light will show through if we don't paint too heavily with the dark, but we'll do that later. Now I'm only mixing a little bit of the green on the palette here, but I'm also picking up straight blue and straight yellow as well and mixing on the paper. And what that actually does is it gives more of an organic colour, look to the colour. So what you'll find that your eye, when you look at the picture, will mix those colours to create green. So for example, down here you can see it's very obviously just yellow, but altogether, because there's blue on the paper in the same space, it looks green. Same with areas that are distinctly just blue. That little bit of yellow that is on the paper and what we see with the eye makes it look green. Now I'm being quite rough with this because it's not a complete piece. What I'm doing here is I'm using the brush, I'm drying it on a paper towel, and then if you put a dry brush to where it's wet with the paint and just brush back, it actually softens the edges. So you see here we've got some quite hard edges where there's wet paint on drier paper. If you use that brush like that, that will actually soften that off and blend it back in. The reason why that happens is because if your brush is dry, if you touch it to the wet paint, the wetness goes into that brush. So you're not really spreading it on the paper, you're just taking some of that wetness off with the brush to give it a softer look, because we don't want those hard edges in this section up here. You can create that later with a bit of dry paint with the darker green. Now looking at the picture, there's also a bit of green on this side as well, just behind these rocks, and I'll just put a bit in there so that we know that there is a bit of blue there. Now I'm using quite a small brush here. This is a size 4 brush, round brush. This is one of my more expensive Winsor & Newton brushes, but it's quite old. You'll find that with the more expensive brushes, you will get a better point on it than a cheaper brush. Even though this brush is probably going on 5 to 6 years old now, you can see that that point, if we just work that, you will see that that still holds a pretty good point. We've got a few stray hairs there. Fine for this sort of landscape work, not so much for if I'm actually doing a very detailed piece. So what we'll do now is we'll let that green dry a bit, but we can work on some of these rocks in this section that are not touching the green. So as I've recommended, the colour blend that we're going to use is a mid-tone blue, which for me is the ultramarine blue, and a darker brown, which here is the burnt sienna. So this actually gives a good neutral grey, very, very good for landscapes. And what you can do to tie it in with the rest of your painting is to use that blue where you're going to use blues in the rest of your painting, which is what I've done with the foliage, and use the browns for anywhere that you need brown. So I did put a little bit of this in the sand, just at the bottom there where there's a little bit of grey. Now this is not the best paper, so there is a bit of dry edges, hard edges there. That's not such an issue for on the sand because you do get a bit of texture on the sand. I'm just going to leave it. The sky, I just roughly painted that in, so it's not going to be as smooth as it would be if I actually used a proper technique. But I just wanted to block it in for this exercise. Now, with the grey, so you mix it and you will get a little bit of blue and a little bit of brown in with your grey mix, and that's fine. It doesn't really matter so much if it's not exactly grey. Like you can see it's more brown there, so if it's more brown you want it more grey, add a little bit more blue. Now I've got not much mixed there, but that's okay because I can mix more. So with the rock, it's quite a light rock, so I'm going to actually add a little bit of water on the paper here with the brush. Now this is a blend brush, it's a sable ester, so it's got some natural fibre and some synthetic. This is quite a nice brush just for doing broad rough work, and because I wet the paper slightly there, when you actually add the paint to the paper, I'm not sure if it's very obvious there, but it will blend into that wet bit, and I just want a little bit of light grey through there for now, and that just to give it shape. I mean, I have drawn the rocks in very faintly. You don't want a lot of dark pencil there because with these sorts of paints, or at least the ones that I have, they're very transparent and a lot of that line work will show through. Not really a problem if you don't mind that look at the end, but some people don't like to have a lot of pencil showing on their work. So here I'm adding a little bit of darker colour, so I've got that light, very light pale grey there, and I'm just going to put in a little bit of dark through there, and you can see how that paint, once it hits the paper, feathers into the water because it was wet there. Now what you're doing here is we're adding a little bit of definition to the rock, and that will go in and give it a nice edge on the sand. So if I put that on there, because the sand here is dry now, so where it hits the sand, it'll give a hard edge, and that's fine. You want that. But, so what we've got here is that rock, that feathering going through the wet bit on the paper. You can leave some of that. I'm using this brush here to just take some of that through the rock and give it texture. So I'm barely touching the paint here. There's no paint on my brush. I'm just using the paint that's on the paper to work it on the paper. And you can actually just slowly smooth that rock out if you want it. But with rocks, they're not really something that have a very straight edge on the bottom, so it doesn't matter. It's a little bit wavy there because, to be honest, that's how rocks are. This particular rock has shape. Now I'm not going to be following the picture exactly because rocks come in all different shapes and sizes, and it doesn't have to be exactly as the photo is because we're not doing a photographic sort of rendition here. We're just painting, we're painting the picture that we see, but you are permitted to have a little bit of license with what you've got. Now, one of the tricky things with rocks is creating the round shape. We're going to slowly work on this. Now, it's a little bit wet now to be doing a lot with it, but I want to add a little bit more dark colour through on this side just to give it a little bit of roundness. Yeah. And often it's better to just work slowly. A little bit of colour here. Now, like I said, this paper is not the best sort of paper. For one thing, it's only 200 GSM, so you can see here there's a little bit of pooling because the paper is buckling, so it's not completely flat. If I was using my better paper, you wouldn't really see that, but I just grabbed what was to hand just now. Now I'm just going to leave that because that actually gives a really nice rock texture to that rock here. I don't want to take away that, because these are the sorts of things that when you work with watercolor is one of the features of watercolor. So that kind of effect you can only really get with water, with the application of water. And I'm not going to touch that because it looks nice, like it looks like a rock, and that's what you want here in this situation. Now, to get this edge here to look more round, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this rock dry completely before I go in behind with a much darker color, so that it shows up more with more definition. I'll show you that maybe a little bit later. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to do this rock, because while this is drying, we don't want to paint anywhere next to it while it's still wet. So we'll do something that's completely separate and won't affect the what we've just painted. I don't know how long this video is going to go for, but I hope that it's actually going to be helpful. So again, I should have added a little bit of water here to the middle of that rock. So that was just right through the middle in this section here. I'm not touching the edges because I want the edges to be a bit more defined. So just a little bit of grey, and I'm touching that to the water there, and I'm working that down to the sand. Now, you can actually soften the colour even more by working back on this edge, but I don't want that to be too soft on that edge. Now, here I'm working here again with no paint on the brush. I've taken the paint off, so now I'm coming back with a little bit of paint on this side. Oh, it's not really focusing here. And with rocks, you can add a little bit more of the brown into it. So if you want to, you can actually put a little bit more brown in this rock rather than just all grey. And even though that's not what's showing on the photo, that doesn't matter, because, as I said, rocks come in all different colours. If you were actually rendering a geological subject where colour does matter, for example, it's got specific minerals, or it's a particular type of rock, then of course you're going to pay a bit more attention to the colour. But for a landscape like this, what you're trying to actually paint is the landscape. So you're painting what you see, but rendering things so that they are recognisable as what they actually are. So this is recognisably a rock. So you're just painting a rock. It doesn't matter what colour it is. I mean, you get people who paint landscapes with all sorts of interesting colours that have nothing to do with the landscape. So you could do a completely red landscape, or people who do tonal paintings where you only use like a very select palette. So you might only use purple and yellow, which gives a very interesting, almost surreal look. Obviously that's not what we're going for here, but that is something that we can do. So again, I'm just going to leave that rock there because it looks all right, and I'll just work on this big one over here. These rocks in the front on the photo actually are quite light, and so we're working with the light paint here. And you can actually also add a different colour, this one, which it's a bit hard to tell with the light on. I might just turn that off. This one here, which is, I think it's a raw sienna, which is a light brown. So I'll just bring that over and I'll show you on the white palette. It's sort of a more yellowy brown. And that's actually what I used for the sand here, although it's not very obvious. So it gives more of a yellow tone to it, which you can actually put on the rock as well. What I'll do is I'll do this as a rock demonstration, and then with the foliage I may actually do that as a separate video, because it is a little bit different. So again, I don't have much paint here left, so I'm going to mix a little bit more. And this is what I like to do. I don't like to mix a lot of straight colour in one go, because I like the variation of a colour, because when you work with watercolour, that's one of the things that you want to keep fresh in the work. So use the top edge here, a bit darker, and it just gives a nice little... I'll turn that light off so it's a bit, you can sort of see more what's going on. And here, the paper is quite dry. What you can do to get a bit of texture is use the brush quite dry as well. There might be a little bit of paint left, but what I'll do is I use the side of the brush and I will actually dry that a bit more. Use that to create a little bit of texture. That's a bit wet actually, it might not work so well. Take a little bit of drier paint and then just sort of roll your brush over the paper, and that actually creates a bit of texture. You probably do this more after this is dried a bit, and you want to add the texture to it. So I'm not even looking at the picture anymore, the photo. I'm just creating the shape as I see it on the paper. So I want this a little bit rounder here, so I'm going to add a little bit of paint there. Oh, a bit darker there, yep. So, yeah. Now, it doesn't matter if there's a little bit more blue than brown in some of this grey, because you can see there, that's got a bit more blue in it, but it gives it a darker, bluer grey. And that's still alright for rocks. Now, currently, this is what it looks like. Fairly pale. With watercolour, we usually work light to dark. Now, for the landscape, typically you would actually work from the back to the front. Because we've got the rock sitting on top of the sand here, I've actually put the sky and the sand first, because you want the rock to sit over the sand. If you actually put the sand after you've done the rocks, that layer of paint will actually go over the edge of that and take away that crisp edge that you get on the bottom of the rock. And you want to preserve that. It's not really focusing very well. And again, the reason why I put the green behind this rock is because I want that green to visually look like it's actually sitting behind that. With the darker colour, what I'm going to do is, actually, before I get to that, I'm just going to say this bit here, I left it quite white, and I don't think that I'll put too much more colour on that there, because it actually gives a sense of dimension by leaving that white there. And one of the things with watercolour is that the white of the paper, it's nice for certain parts of your picture to have the white of the paper come through as the lightest values. So if you want to leave that white, that's fine. You can give it a very light wash otherwise with that yellowy, or maybe with a darker brown or a grey. You can actually give it a very light, just do a light wash, so that there was paint there. It's not very obvious, but it's given it a little bit of colour. So that's the stark white of the paper, and there's a little bit of colour on there that that just gives it a little bit of dimension. Now, the thing about the greens in the foliage, well, I am talking about the green now, you're going to get different colours. So the green of the picture is quite a yellow green. I've got two yellows here. There's this yellow, which is the Windsor yellow. That's your basic yellow. It's semi-opaque, and it gives sort of a grey kind of green. I've got another yellow here. It looks very tan in the paint, but once you actually tint it out, so that basically means if you're adding water to it, it becomes much grassier. So I add the same blue to it, and it's a much brighter, a brighter green. So well, it's a bit of mixed up here, but it's a darker colour at the moment. But it's a grassier green than this one, which is a bit more grey, and that's due to the opacity of that particular paint. So it's the same blue, but different yellows will give a slightly different look. Now, I'm actually going to use mostly this green for now. And I'm going to lightly drop behind here, and yeah, Now this is fairly, the paper is dry, and this is just paint going on dry paper. And in this instance, I don't want to have soft edges. So there is a little bit of softness about it, but that's because of the, well, I'm going to say the organic look of the paint being applied. So you've got bits of colour through here, and I'm just putting it in however I want. So I've left bits of the underside, underpainting showing through. Now it's getting to look quite green there. What you can do is you can add a bit more blue to it and create more of a blue green. Now you can add some of that blue into that green that you've just put down, and that actually creates a different look about it. And this is the kind of thing that I really like to do. And you can wet your brush a little bit if you want to just blend it back in, or just leave it and mix that up a bit, because you want to leave these edges because it's like the edges of the leaf. Okay, now there is more detail in that foliage, but that is optional whether you want to actually add that kind of thing or not. You can add straight blue into this to give it a very dark look about it, and there are sections of foliage where you will see that. You'll see that very dark that look about it. Again, you can also use that grey that we've mixed with the brown to give it a little bit more depth in that foliage, because it's not just blue. Add a little bit of darkness to it. And again, in this painting so far, we've only used a few colours, but there are an infinite number of blends that you can get just even with those few paint colours that you use. And I will add more green. It doesn't look like much at the moment, but once you actually do all of it, it'll look a bit more like a picture. So right now what we're doing is we're just adding some of that colour in. And one of the things about the paints is that different paints and the pigments that they use in them will have different effects. This particular blue, this ultramarine, has a granulating effect, and what that means is that the pigment's quite heavy and it's a slightly coarser ground pigment than some of the other ones that you can get. And what happens is that when you actually put on the paper, it moves. So you can see there's a bit of blooming happening in that foliage. Sorry, I'll just move that